3ds Max Fluids is an implementation of the Bifrost application, and so is the Motion Field Space Warp. It's from Bifrost as well. And it can affect a liquid simulation, but it can also be used as a geometric deformer. In this case, we will use the motion field as a modeling tool to create a simple landscape with a mountain and some turbulence. I've already set up the units and the grid in this scene. Let's check in on that. Under Customize, Units Setup, I'm using meters as my display units. To check on the grid settings, let's right-click on any one of the magnet icons on the main toolbar. Go to the home grid. I've got a grid line every 10 meters, a major grid line every 10 times 10 or 100 meters. And in the perspective view, the grid extends from center to edge 60 grid lines or 600 meters. Close the grid and snap settings. Let's create a geometric plane. In the Create panel, under Geometry, Standard Primitives, click the Plane button, click and drag in the perspective view, right-click to End Creation, and with that object still selected, go to the Modify panel and rename it Terrain. Go into its colors and change it to a neutral gray. Set the parameters so that it will be 1 kilometer on a side. The length, 1,000 meters. Press the Tab key, set the width to 1,000 as well. Press the Tab key again, and we need a lot of length and width segments in order to resolve the deformation. Set length segments to 200, press Tab, and width segments also to 200, and press Enter. And in the Render Multipliers section, we have a readout of the total number of faces. We currently have 80,000 faces. We can increase the density at render time so that this will be nice and smooth. Set the density to a value of 4. And now when this renders, it will have 1.28 million triangles. With that plane still selected, center it on the world. From the main toolbar, choose the Select and Move tool and set the X and Y values to 0. Go back to the Select Object tool and create a motion field, and that's going to be in the Space Warps section. So go to the Create panel and choose Space Warps. Click Motion Field. Click and drag in the perspective viewport. Right-click to exit creation. With that object still selected, go to the Modify panel and rename it. We'll call this Motion Field Mountain. In the Modify panel, we have some properties that we can enable or disable. We also have a global enable switch for the entire motion field. If we open up the Direction section, we'll see that it has a magnitude of 1, and that's on by default. Below that, we have the X, Y, and Z values. And X is defaulted to 1, which is not going to give any result on an object of this scale. And since I want to create a mountain with this motion field, I want the Z axis to be the active one. Set the X magnitude to 0 and the Z magnitude to 100. We can localize the effect by using a boundary object. In the Properties, enable Boundary. Now we have a new rollout labeled Boundary. At this point, if we have some overlap in the volume of the motion field and the terrain object, then we will see some effect when we bind the object to the motion field. If you need to, you can move the motion field onto the terrain object. And then now select the Bind to Space Warp from the main toolbar. Click on the terrain and drag over to the motion field object in any viewport. And that binding's now been made. And if we look in the perspective view, we can see that there is an offset. Let's go back to the Select Object tool. Maximize the perspective view with Alt-W. Just click in that view and use Alt-W. Tumble around, and we can see that there is indeed an offset there. Reselect the motion field. Set its boundary type to cylinder. And set the height to 700 meters, the radius to 500 meters, and increase the fall off And as we do that, we can see that it's changing the shape, getting closer there. We can adjust that fall off value to get the effect we want. I'll set it to a value of 3. Go back to the 4 viewport layout with Alt-W. And finally, select that motion field and position it in the top viewport while observing the result in the physical camera viewport. And I've got the edged faces enabled here. I can turn those off if I want with F4. The grid is also enabled. We can disable that if we want to with the G key. Now we've got a very simple mountain. We can create a rolling landscape with a turbulence effect with another motion field. Go back to the Create panel, to Space Warps, Motion Field, click and drag in the Perspective view, right-click to End Object Creation, go to the Modify panel, and rename this one. We'll call it Motion Field Turbulence. Let's center this in the world to make it easier to see what we're doing. Set the X position to 0 and the Y position 0 also. We can go back to the Select Object tool, and with the Motion Field Turbulence selected in its Modify panel, let's disable Direction. And now we're not deforming the vertices in any uniform direction. In the Properties, enable Turbulence and Noise. Also enable Boundary. And we've got the boundary shape of box. Let's set the length, width, and height all to 500. And now we're ready once again to bind the terrain object to the space warp. Choose Bind to Space Warp from the main toolbar. Click and drag from the terrain object to the Space Warp Turbulence object. Once that's done, we can see on the plane object we have 2 new modifiers. Those are the Max Vector Field Binding World Space modifiers, or in other words, those are the bindings to the motion fields. I'll go back to the Select Object tool, reselect Motion Field Turbulence, and let's start working on its parameters. To see the effect, increase the magnitude, and we may need to turn that all the way up, just temporarily, to its maximum of 10. Tumble around in the perspective view and maybe turn off the grid with the G key. And we don't see much effect because the frequency is very low. Click and drag on that as well. And as we bring it up into the range of about 7 or 8, it starts to look like something. I'll set that to a value of 8. There are 2 types of turbulence available. The default is curl noise. Switch that over to curl fractal. That's going to be much more naturalistic. We can take a better look in the perspective view. Use Alt-W to maximize that viewport. And I'll get in closer. Here's our deformed terrain. If we want to make adjustments to the scaling, we can either use these turbulence scale parameters here to stretch the effect. Set that back to a value of 1. Or indeed, we can use the width and height of the boundary. And that will not only crop the boundary, but it will actually scale the noise effect as well. I'll set the length, width, and height all back to 500. Now that we have the effect that we want, we can actually turn the boundary off. And when we do that, we will see that the size of the pattern that we determined with the boundary will remain constant even if the boundary is disabled. Okay, all that remains is a little bit of fine tuning. We don't really need a magnitude of 10. Let's set that to a value of 5. Let's go back to our physical camera. We can choose the physical camera from the viewport menu and enable Save Frames with Shift F. To analyze this better, we can use edged faces with F4. And finally, adjust the phase of the noise. And the best way to do that is by adjusting the turbulence offset in the Z-axis. As I drag this up and down, we're actually moving the pattern vertically, and that is causing different results on our landscape. I'll set the turbulence offset in Z to 3.3. Here's an Arnold rendering of our landscape with a simple ideal diffuse material applied. That's how to use a Bifrost motion field space warp as a modeling tool to deform the vertices on a polygon object.